In May 2022, Blut released Disharrnonium, Undreamable Abysses, and that was followed not much later, the following year in August 2023, by Disharrnonium Nahab. Both releases were explicitly inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, with particular interest in a short story entitled The Dreams in the Witch House. I imagine most Blut fans, or at least a good number of them, are avid readers of Lovecraft. I know I am. I've got that big commemorative edition of Necronomicon, which contains The Dreams in the Witch House and is a lot of fun to dip into from time to time. So, I have spoken about Blut before, so I'll try not to repeat too much of what I've already said, but there used to be two very distinct sides to the Blut sound. You've got the nightmarish, perspective-bending, metaphysical black metal with its industrial and experimental edge. That's the side that started with the mystical beast of rebellion and was perfected on the work which transforms God, but was continued to be explored by Vince Val, the sole member, the genius behind the Blut project, and he has continued to explore the experimental side. But then on the other side, you've got the lush melodic black metal in the classic 90s tradition, which mainly comes from the Memoria Vetusta releases, but you can now find it on other non-Vetusta releases too, such as the most recent album, Ethereal Horizons, which I may speak about one day, or else I might not. Now, I said it used to be two distinct sides because you can find a slight bleeding from one side to the other, in my opinion, through the 777 sequence, which starts on the world-bending and more industrial and experimental side of the catalogue with Sect and the Desanctification. But then in the final part, Cosmosophy, you can find clean vocals and beautiful melodies, which I was instantly reminded of when I heard Shadows Breathing First from Ethereal Horizons, the most recent release. So there is a crossover between the two sides if you're looking for it. The two Disharrnonium releases are unambiguously on the nightmarish and trippy side of the Blut catalogue. This is the side that makes Vince Val such a special and unique artist. You can enjoy the Memoria Vetusta releases, the melodic black metal side, but melodic black metal already existed. Those albums are Vince Val's version of it, whereas the sound in the world he created on the work which transforms God, for example, is unique to Vince Val, and it's something I've never heard before or anywhere else. So to me, that is far more valuable than just doing a version of melodic black metal, however good the music might be. So, we've got two Disharrnonium releases. At a high level, Undreamable Abysses is a darker exploration of the psychedelic world Vince Val created on Hallucinogen. But with that said, it is still a very accessible album, and it's got some instantly memorable songs, such as The Open Out Chance of the Deep Ones and Neptune's Eye. And then on the other side, you've got Nahab, which I'm going to go ahead and describe as a work of genius, and my second favourite Blut album, just ahead of Cosmosophy. And I don't say that lightly, that's a big step for me. I do take my lists and my ratings very seriously, and obviously I don't know what Vince Val thinks about this record now, or both of these releases now. It's not necessarily for the artist to decide what a piece of work is once it's out there in the world and it belongs to the world, but I am declaring that Nahab is a work of insane genius, and I would also say it's the least accessible Blut album. And although I'm talking about these releases here, I'm not talking about them as a critic. I'm not a critic, I'm talking about them as a fan of the band, and I'm really just going to try and put across my experience with both of these records. And the first point is that I didn't love Nahab from day one. All I could take from the early spins is that I could tell it was a nightmarish Blut album, and I liked listening to it and I enjoyed the atmosphere, but it took a really long time for me to develop any kind of relationship with the songs. I started to recognise the various parts after a while, but I was lost as far as knowing what I was supposed to be feeling at various points, and if you played a random part to me, even after multiple spins, I probably wouldn't have known which song I was listening to, or even roughly where in the album I was, whether it's at the beginning or at the other end. And I think there's a scale of how well you know an album. Perfect knowledge of an album is when you know every word to every song. Forget what the concept of the album is or anything else that takes place outside of the record. If you know all of the lyrics, you really can't know an album any better than that. Whether I dare mention it or not here, I guess I will. But the two albums that come to my mind as the albums I have perfect knowledge of, the albums I know the best, are actually Antichrist Superstar and Mechanical Animals by Marilyn Manson. You could drop me in anywhere and I could happily sing myself to the end of the album. With black metal, there are barriers to having that kind of knowledge, that depth. Firstly, the lyrics are generally screamed or screeched, so you can't naturally pick up the lyrics. When you're listening to Fundamentally Loathsome from Mechanical Animals, which I'm sure all of you do all of the time, you're going to naturally pick up the words and know exactly where you are in the album. Whereas it's hard, not impossible, but it's really hard to do that with black metal. You generally would have to make a good effort to learn the words to a black metal song. And then some black metal bands don't even print the lyrics, so you'll never know what they are. And then of course this is international music, so you can often be listening to lyrics in another language, which is yet another barrier. I've spoken about Paysage d'Hiver a lot. That's one of my all-time favourite projects or bands or artists, but I don't know any of the lyrics, and there are probably songs I can't even name. But even with a band that I enjoy that much, I still have that barrier because of the lyrics. But going back to Blut Nord and finding an example in this catalogue, The Work Which Transforms God is all-time top 5 for me, but not knowing the lyrics will always keep it at arm's length. It's alien music in the first place. It's designed not to be known too well, so that's probably part of the allure of the album and this type of music. It's part of the intrigue and the mystery of Blut Nord. But I'm never going to know The Work Which Transforms God as well as I know Mechanical Animals. So what I'm saying here is that Nahab is the least accessible Blut Nord album, because I did find that I didn't get to know the songs naturally just by playing the album in the background. I had to consciously work out what the songs were and match the song titles to the songs and think about the structure of the album. If I hadn't done that, I don't think it would have ever clicked in any kind of serious way. So what I would say is that I think this isn't a demanding record. It's not an album that forces you to lean in. It is quite possible just to enjoy the sound and the atmosphere of the album, and that can give you a lot of pleasure on its own. But my experience is that it massively rewards the listener who does lean in and wants to know if it's possible to feel the music in a deeper way and have a more meaningful relationship with it. And although I'm saying it's inaccessible, it's not actually a long album. It's only 11 tracks, and 3 of those are short mood pieces, so it's only 8 full tracks that aren't especially long, and the whole album's only about 44 minutes. But still, my picture of the album was really only formed and came into focus when I paid attention to those 3 mood tracks and where they fit in. So the structure in the track list actually goes like this. There are 3 short instrumental pieces, mood pieces, which are called Hideous Dream Opus. So you got Hideous Dream Opus 1, followed by Mental Paralysis and The Endless Multitude. Then you get the break with Hideous Dream Opus 2, and then there's 4 tracks in a row: The Crowning Horror, Queen of the Dead Dimension, The Black Vortex and Nameless Rite. And then you get the final break, Hideous Dream Opus 3, and the final 2 tracks, The Ultimate Void of Chaos and Forgotten Eon. And a little side note on that is a lot of these song titles, not all of them, but you can find a lot of them in the short story, the Lovecraft story, The Dreams in the Witch House. So fully influenced by that story, and obviously Nahab comes from that story as well. And what really happened for me is that that central section of the album became almost a standalone EP all of its own, a standalone work of genius, and that was my hook for getting to know the whole album. And speaking of those songs in particular, those 4 songs, I really understood that this isn't ugly music. I'm not saying anybody did say it was, but it isn't ugly music. It's dark, and it can be creepy and sinister and chaotic when it speeds up, but there are also moments of elegance and real extraordinary beauty. For example, Queen of the Dead Dimension and Nameless Rite. When the album started to sink in and click, these are the tracks I especially wanted here again. They are genuinely beautiful, and I would say actually that beauty is embedded in Vince Val's music. I can imagine somebody saying the melodic black metal is beautiful, because it is, but I genuinely think all of this music is. It's innate in the work. That's my perspective, and maybe it can change your approach to this music if you do think of it in those terms. Now, the first 3 tracks and the final 3 tracks are also an amazing part of the album, and they are an essential platform for the central section, especially when the whole album was starting to come into focus for me. I could almost slide out the central section and then take the intro and outro section and push them together as a separate EP. Perhaps you'd have to remove the 3rd Hideous Dream Opus, and then you would have 2 EPs which are an intro and then 4 full tracks each with that intro at the start. That's not how I see the album now, obviously, because the whole piece is perfectly constructed and complete as it is, in my experience anyway. But I think the thought occurred to me because I was feeling that this music, this strange and convoluted piece of art, isn't digestible past a certain length, and there are 2 reasons and 2 releases that made me think that. One of them is Mort, which I always felt could have ended after 5 or perhaps 6 tracks. I've listened to that album loads of times over the years, and after the 5th track I always think, no matter how much I think I'm in the mood for it, I always think that's all I need, I'm ready to move on. And compared to Nahab, Mort is actually a relatively accessible release, but I just don't think it needs 8 tracks. I've always felt that. And then reinforcing that feeling is the Codex Obscura Nomina EP. Okay, I know technically it's not an EP, it's a split release, but when I listen to that CD, I'm listening to it for the Blut Nord part, and that EP to me is essentially perfect. It's 4 tracks in the Nahabish style, the harrowing style, but it's perfectly accessible and digestible at that length. So when I still hadn't grasped Nahab, I thought it was because the better model for this type of material is the EP format. And maybe that is still true to a degree, but not for Nahab in my view. Now I've touched on the central songs in Nahab. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I will say a brief word about the other sections. The 2 intro tracks after Hideous Dream Opus 1 are Mental Paralysis and The Endless Multitude, forgetting the fact that there are specific references to a particular Lovecraft story, The Dreams in the Witch House. Whether Vince Vella's actually mapped that story across somehow, I don't know, or if it's just inspiration for the different songs, but the way the albums appear to me is that Undreamable Abysses is more like the experience of just being in a Lovecraftian world and encountering these unspeakable, unimaginable horrors, and then perhaps Nahab, which opens with a track called Mental Paralysis, that could be more about the mental state of the traumatized man who's actually experiencing a Lovecraftian story, so it's more subjective compared to Undreamable Abysses, which is more objective. That's a very simple interpretation, but at an abstract level it makes some kind of sense to me, and Mental Paralysis does a great job of introducing you to how that might feel. The Endless Multitude is one of the tracks that didn't land with me during the early spins, but over time it's crept its way under my skin, and it's one I always look forward to experiencing. You don't listen to The Endless Multitude, you experience it. And then the final 2 tracks after Hideous Dream Opus 3, this is The Ultimate Void of Chaos and Forgotten Eon. This is an acceleration, and these tracks are going to take you to the end of your sanity. So the first 3 tracks and the final 3 tracks construct and collapse the narrative, while the central section fits into that experience, but in practice it is quite simply phenomenally good music. The one note I might give is that if you're going to call a track The Ultimate Void of Chaos, which is actually a phrase from the short story, I would expect it to be fast from beginning to end. Still a fine song, but not quite what I was expecting from the title. But anyway, that's pretty much my assessment and perspective on Nahab. I am conscious that I haven't mentioned the vocals beyond saying we don't have any lyrics. The vocals are deep growls that are really just a layer or another texture that forms part of the overall sound. They don't lead the music in any way or take centre stage. They're more of a subtlety while the music works its traumatic magic around you. They lurk within the miasma, I'll put it that way. Now, Undreamable Abysses is obviously part of the same world sonically and conceptually, and it also follows very neatly on from the trippier and more psychedelic world and excesses of the Hallucinogen album, but I still find it a lot more straightforward than Nahab, and I haven't found any much deeper layers or really a deeper level of pleasure as I got to know the songs better. To me, it's just a generally enjoyable Blut Nord release. I've already said that Chance of the Deep Ones and Neptune's Eye are my favourite tracks, and perhaps that cannot be named as well, which follows Neptune's Eye. These are really distinctive and memorable songs. And following what I said a moment ago, the bass in Chance of the Deep Ones is almost a sound effect rather than music. When I hear that song, even from the very first spin, I get a picture in my mind of being aboard a ship in the middle of the ocean. There's water all around me, there's no land in sight, and I can see huge undulations in the water because some gigantic Lovecraftian monster of the deep is lurking just beneath the surface. That's the visual I get from this song, that's what I take from it. And I'd also say it is my favourite song from Undreamable Abysses. It's instant, and amazingly enough, it's actually a very catchy song, and you can just listen to it any time and it's always a pleasure. A vertigo-inducing, horrifying pleasure, of course. And again, I'm not going to talk through all the songs. I've named my favourites and I've explained how I feel about the whole album. So it's the one I enjoyed listening to more when it was new to me, but over time, Nahab has proved itself to be the special one that improves and improves with repeated spins and familiarity with the songs. That is how I feel about it, and I think I've made my case by now. Ethereal Horizons came out recently, and I've been enjoying that too. I've actually been up and down most of the Blut Nord catalogue a lot recently, which was prompted by the release of Ethereal Horizons. It sparked a new phase of listening to Blut Nord albums. There are plenty of them, and there are some in there that I perhaps haven't listened to for a very long time. I do sometimes think I'd like to go in and retrospectively sculpt the Blut Nord catalogue into something leaner and tighter. But the point I was going to make is that the top end records by Blut Nord do contain some of the best music I've ever heard, and because there's so much music in this catalogue now, if you were new to Blut Nord, it would probably be very difficult and daunting to take it all in. So it feels like a huge stroke of luck to me that I've been able to follow the catalogues it's been created. The first Blut Nord record I got was Thematic Emanation of October Multiplicity back in, I think it was 2005, and it's strange, but I kind of get the sense that it's one of the least popular Blut Nord releases, but it's the one that got me into the band, especially those first 2 tracks. That's what introduced me to the world-bending universe of Vince Val. It was like nothing I'd ever heard, and I just instantly fell in love with it. That was over 20 years ago, and we're still getting new music that is genuinely outstanding. So even this far into the project, the announcement of a new Blut Nord record is always a moment of great excitement for me. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the Disharrnonium releases. I hope you liked them and maybe even found them useful. I will be back soon with more videos. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day.